Sometimes, a game comes along whose essence checks all the right boxes for you. And for me, when that game is developed by a passionate, independent team with a unique vision that is crystal clear, I know I'm strapping myself into an experience I'll remember for a long time. Most recently, this came in the form of Sea of Stars, a turn-based RPG developed and published by Sabotage Studio. I wasn't a fan of their previous work just yet, but after seeing the style of game it was trying to evoke, I knew it was for me, as it is not only highly reminiscent of Chrono Trigger, one of the most influential JRPGs of all time, but also Super Mario RPG, an outstanding and revered entry point to the genre that recontextualized many JRPG trappings for an audience that was unfamiliar with them. Sea of Stars thus fills a niche for two distinct audiences, of which I somehow fall somewhere in the middle of. These include RPG enthusiasts looking to take a trip back to the past without some of the headaches those aged design trends induce, as well as new players to the genre that may feel intimidated by the lengthy commitments and more complex mechanics of its contemporary counterparts. Most interesting to me was the addition of more action-based elements, such as the timed hit system, puzzle solving, and full range of movement, offering more meaningful interactions with the world. And when combined with one of the best-looking pixel art styles of the modern era, with fully dynamic lighting shining both the warmth of the sun and the glow of the moon on this enchanting world with a gorgeous tropical backdrop, I was fully captured. If you know me, it's obvious why this initial pitch felt like a match made in heaven, but that's not why I've chosen to talk about Sea of Stars. It's because there's another element at play that I believe has led to a somewhat polarized response from those who have completed it, while, from my point of view, elevating it from just a solid game to one I haven't been able to stop thinking about. In many ways, Sea of Stars was exactly what I was hoping for. It wasn't particularly difficult in most areas, but it still felt great to play thanks to its relatively quick pace and said action elements offering more interesting interactions in both combat and the world. And for that matter, the richness of the world building explored through the lens of a duty-bound duo of protagonists was easily my highlight of the experience, making me feel eager to discover what was hiding around each and every corner. In just short of 40 hours of play, I believe I experienced everything notable it had to offer, which is an incredibly rare task for me to complete, and I think that should properly demonstrate just how much I enjoyed my time in Sea of Stars. However, there was something that bothered me by the time the credits began to roll, and it honestly made me take a step back to reevaluate my experience. Now, I believe what I'm about to say could potentially sway someone away from playing Sea of Stars for themselves, which is absolutely not the message I intend to send. To be clear, I would absolutely recommend this game to players like myself that have historically had trouble getting into RPGs, particularly urging those currently on the fence to give it a shot, because like most things, I believe games are worth more than the sum of their parts. So if Sea of Stars is on your list, or you're currently playing it, the best thing you can do is dive into it and shield yourself from my thoughts until you've finished. But if you're stubborn like me and need to know what I'm so delicately dancing around, listen carefully. Sea of Stars is the start of something bold, risky, and worth taking a deeper look at, sharing a connective tissue with its studio's history and their previous work that has made me think twice about its contents. And to be perfectly honest, it isn't possible to convey my most important takeaways without delving into some degree of spoilers for this game and its predecessor. If you're the type that enjoys experiencing games relatively blind, well, you should know what to do. But if you really need some convincing, proceed with caution. With that out of the way, let's continue. While I greatly enjoyed the vast majority of this game, including the narrative full of so many twists and turns that left me taking no moment for granted, if there is one major criticism I can see a number of players taking away from Sea of Stars, it's that by the end of the game, it's easy to feel as if the story stretches itself too thin while failing to deliver the necessary amount of payoff. It asks many questions, and unless you're reading between the lines or have knowledge of the wider context, a few of which go critically unanswered by the time the credits roll, it left me feeling really conflicted about what I just experienced, and I felt as though I had to reach or dig deep to make sense of certain characters' motivations and how they were resolved. To some, that is undoubtedly going to feel disappointing. It's as if a game you just spent 30 hours completing either ended on a cliffhanger or simply had no intention of wrapping up its loose ends. For a release in a genre that is most often defined for its ability to deliver compelling stories, it's a reasonable concern. But what I came to find out, and what altered my own disappointment into a hunger to seek and learn as much as I could about this mysterious and fascinating world, is that the end of Sea of Stars indeed isn't the full story. There's a moment close to halfway through the game where the scope of this world begins to widen far beyond my expectations. Shortly after, the party steps through a portal leading to a brand new area called Glacial Peak. And following this puzzling and tender moment, the music begins to swell in a boisterous and triumphant way. This caught me off guard in a way I don't think I'll ever forget, knowing what I know now. Because as a late adopter of this world, I had only an inkling of how impactful this moment was for the countless players who began this journey long before I did, which led me to this moment. In an effort to get a better understanding of what the hell this game was trying to say, following my completion of Sea of Stars, I dug around for more information and fell down a rabbit hole of real history that made me view it quite differently. Because in order to get an idea of what Sabotage is attempting to build here, you actually have to look outside of the game. In my case, through a number of interviews along with the studio's rich history diligently chronicled on their website. And I think that regardless of whether it changes your mind on Sea of Stars or reinforces the belief you already hold, at the core of this game and its studio, I believe I've stumbled upon an important message that transcends any single game. A message I feel compelled to share, and to do that, I need to begin telling you a different story. One that begins with just a curious boy in a bottomless bag of NES games. When Thierry Boulanger was 8 years old, his grandfather showed up unannounced to his family's home with a paper bag full of NES games salvaged from a closing family business. And after being offered 6 games to keep, Thierry was forced to make a final, critical choice between 2 games that would send a ripple effect across his life. Following an afternoon of playtesting, he chose Ninja Gaiden 2. And after embedding himself in its challenging and rewarding gameplay, infectious music, and unique approach to world building through story-rich cutscenes, Thierry fell in love with video games, seeking refuge from the harshness of reality in the worlds only this medium can provide. This avenue of escape and entertainment enchanted him, and it wasn't long before a dream to provide others what was given to him began to take shape as a fantasy world of his own began to brew inside his head. As he grew older, however, the bright light that was lit by Ninja Gaiden began to dim, and Thierry satiated his need to create by playing drums in punk bands while studying to become a professional cook in pursuit of a more realistic career path. But all the while, the landscape of game development was changing, lowering the barrier to entry worldwide and even in his hometown of Quebec City. After realizing cooking wasn't his true calling, Thierry made a courageous choice alongside a close friend to return to school and begin studying games programming, the first step in a new chapter that would dramatically alter the course of his life. With little more than a dream and an inability to thrive in an academic environment on his own, Thierry leveraged his ability to foster connections, offering companionship to a new friend in exchange for the help he needed to get through his programming course. The exchange was far from transactional, however, as Thierry displayed a natural ability to connect and encourage others to buy into a shared goal and dream, a skill that would later become indispensable in his career as a game developer. During this time, he began his first project in class based upon his love for Ninja Gaiden, a flash prototype of his own ninja game called Darkest Night, drawing upon the world brewing in his head since childhood for inspiration. Before even completing his academic program, Thierry landed a job at a local studio with a group of friends. And over the course of several years spent honing his skills as a gameplay programmer, he learned to effectively manage projects by focusing on careful planning and communication, cultivating many more connections in the process. With 7 years of experience under his belt, Thierry felt as though he was ready to begin turning his childhood dream into reality, urging his employer to permit his transition from programming to design. He even crafted a pitch based on Darkest Night to show them what he was capable of and what he wanted to achieve. Unfortunately for them, the pitch was more or less laughed out of the room, as Thierry was told to stay in his lane, giving him no reason to believe he would ever accomplish his goal with his current employer. I say, unfortunately for them, because this rejection was the push Thierry and his new partner, Philippe Barclay, needed to leave and begin laying the foundations of their own studio where dreams would be made true and one of the coolest universes in gaming would be cultivated. With a growing eye for fresh talent, Thierry then began reaching out to others cut from the same cloth who could help him realize his dream, such as Michael Lavoie, a level artist who, similarly to Thierry, demonstrated a passion for pristine pixel art while not being given the opportunity to apply such a skill to his day-to-day work. But not before Philippe Dion, a veteran of level design, having previously worked on Prince of Persia and Assassin's Creed with a similar interest in Ninja Gaiden. And thanks to ace programmer Sylvain Cloutier, Sabotage's first official employee alongside founders Thierry and business manager Martin Brouard, Thierry met Eric Brown, perhaps better known as Rainbow Dragon Eyes, a touring metal artist with a fascination for chiptune who agreed to compose the music after virtually zero convincing. While recruiting began for another team at Sabotage, helping finance the entire studio by providing development support to Oddworld Soulstorm before rejoining the main team responsible for Sea of Stars. This core, along with just a few more key additions like character artists Savannah Perron and Jean-Luc Savard, QA lead Carl Dubroy, and even last-minute freelance producer Magali Allard, formed a close-knit team tasked with helping bring Thierry's creative vision to life in a burgeoning space for independently developed video games. Over the course of the next few years, working in tight spaces and seeking additional funding wherever they could find it, this team created a ninja game to call their own, a simple game signifying the start of a new chapter with such guiding principles as subverting expectations and creating the definitive edition of what they fell in love with in their youth. A game simply titled The Messenger. Now, this 2D ninja platformer is definitely not Sea of Stars, but you might be surprised to discover just how connected the two are. While the desire to create an open love letter to Chrono Trigger was always in the back of his mind, Thierry's first love was Ninja Gaiden, and development of The Messenger served two purposes a more ambitious, turn-based RPG could not, establishing the world and the studio with a simpler, lower resource idea with a unique twist to set it apart. It could be argued that on the surface, The Messenger's ability to attract widespread appeal was somewhat limited by its strong desire to pay homage to the ninja games of the past. And with no prior attachment to the Ninja Gaiden games, that may be a reason as to why it completely passed me by at the time of its release when I was in a very different chapter of my own life. However, because Sea of Stars acted as a more fitting gateway for me into the Sabotage universe, I was able to approach The Messenger with renewed interest and consideration, and I was kind of shocked to discover a game I didn't know I needed. Through a process of analyzing the essence of a classic before pruning obsolete design choices and adding elements of their own to better get a modern audience invested, the team delivered a rock-solid tight-to-control throwback platformer that captures the style and challenge of the NES era without feeling too archaic and punishing. Enemies have simple designs and limited functions that provide the appropriate level of challenge, even respawning once immediately out of frame like so many of the games that inspired them. They're punishing if approached carelessly, but never placed unfairly, and can even be easily exploited with knowledge and skill. Death is inevitable and common, but checkpoints are placed adequately, and the game uses humor to make light of failure, while the actual punishment for death is actually just a means of keeping the player's progression balanced in disguise. And at the core of it all, there is a simple yet vital addition that elevates this game's movement from being just representative of the past to highly addictive and satisfying: the cloud step. By attacking an enemy or interactable piece of the environment while in the air, the ninja can perform a second jump, and a third, and a fourth. As long as the player remains focused and demonstrates mastery of the ability, they can theoretically stay in the air for as long as there is another object to cloud step from. And once they've understood it, they will be chaining this maneuver with a wide array of unlockable abilities in a feat of skill expression rivaling some of the best mechanically intensive movement-based platformers of the modern era. The Messenger initially reminded me of Shovel Knight in these ways, and had it remained just that, a solid love letter to the platformers of old with a few notable modern refinements, I'm not sure it would have accomplished more than a nice one-and-done project would, for a team hoping to get a taste of independence. But that's not the Sabotage way, because what allowed it to be considered one of the best among a masterclass of 2018 indies, even taking the Game Award for Best Indie Game from a Debuting Studio, is how it embraced the cliche before smashing through player expectation with a highly amusing sense of self-awareness. After reaching what appears to be the end of this linear, prophecy-fulfilling adventure, while the game repeatedly shatters the fourth wall to recognize its inspirations and poke a great deal of fun at itself, The Messenger performs a full genre swap, becoming a Metroidvania about time travel from the 8-bit expectation to the 16-bit reality, a unique idea utilized to the fullest extent. The aesthetic changes, the music changes, and the ninja gets a killer bamboo hat. But most importantly, there's a constant need to time hop through tears in the environment to get to places he couldn't before. It's the secret sauce that elevates an admittedly basic but solid recipe into something truly unforgettable, leading to interesting design choices that also enhance the narrative through more humor and environmental storytelling. I can't say I was expecting such rich world-building mechanics from a game of this nature, which proved to be a big reason why I found myself paying close attention to every screen while I was locked in from beginning to end, combing through past areas for secrets I couldn't reach before, as well as an abundance of new areas. Exploring the limits of the new dual-era Metroidvania angle presented the perfect opportunity to demonstrate mastery of the ninja's abilities, making short and eloquent work of the challenges that felt so much more daunting at the onset. By retreading the same areas numerous times, I stopped viewing enemies as an obstruction and more of an opportunity, as I progressed with an unrestricted sense of flow, challenging myself to see how much of each screen I could traverse without touching the ground. Clearly, The Messenger found a fresh way to fulfill the ninja fantasy fans of the original Ninja Gaiden games must have felt after replaying the same stages over and over again, overcoming the punishing level design through means of memorization and determination. For this reason alone, The Messenger is absolutely worth playing in its own right. After all, it wouldn't have been recognized as such if it wasn't exceptional in this regard. But ever since the release of Sea of Stars, there has been extra incentive to do so, because playing through these levels over and over again gets players abundantly familiar with the world Sabotage is building. Now, I want to put you back in my shoes immediately following my completion of Sea of Stars for a moment, because while the manner in which I experienced these games in direct sequence stemmed from my own ignorance, I think the transition demonstrates the unique appeal and large risks tied to Sabotage's approach to world building. And I'm willing to bet there are and will be many other players out there like me continuing to discover Sabotage's works. It's no secret Sea of Stars is a prequel story to The Messenger, as this very selling point was one of the defining aspects of Sabotage's Kickstarter for Sea of Stars. But as just a simple fan of the games Sea of Stars wished to emulate, and not Sabotage's previous work, I went into the game with skepticism regarding how deep the connections could run between a game striving to tell an immersive story about duty, prophecy, and friendship, and a decidedly gameplay-first experience laughing in the face of cliché. And that may be why I walked away from Sea of Stars with mostly confusion and a sprinkle of curiosity. Heading into The Messenger, I expected a little more than a handful of references littered here and there. But what I was given was an almost direct continuation of the existing narrative. Granted, it does take place thousands of years in the future, but I can earnestly say that just minutes after beginning the game, my jaw hit the floor with just the introduction of its key players. What I found after blasting through The Messenger was not so much closure to all the questions I had following Sea of Stars, but a promise that the arcs of these characters are really a small piece of a much larger goal. The beauty of this specific approach is because both of these games tell largely independent stories with different sets of protagonists. Players can experience the wonderful transition in whichever order they see fit. What fans of The Messenger must have felt after emerging from that portal into Sea of Stars' glacial peak, I felt after beginning the very first level of The Messenger, one that felt all too familiar. As a vast expansion of the world established by The Messenger, Sea of Stars starts much slower and doesn't begin heavily laying down references until that glacial peak moment roughly halfway through the game, acting as a teaser for what mysteries there are to follow on the enigmatic Mesa Island. It's a strange chapter of the game, as the island once shrouded in a dense, magical fog is revealed to be the same place where the majority of The Messenger is set aeons later. In adherence to The Messenger's design, building a false sense of cliched expectation by placing the player in a variety of starkly contrasting environments, Mesa Island is made to feel like no other area in the Solstice Warriors world. It utilizes its point of reference to The Messenger to greatly expand the scope of the plot, while showing how things have changed in the thousands of years between the two games. And this is all on top of the already excellent lore and world building unique to Sea of Stars. For longtime Sabotage fans, it's a fantastic reveal. But from a design perspective, what makes this place additionally fascinating to me is actually less about how things have changed and more about just how much remains the same between Sabotage's two releases belonging to distinctly different genres. What really blew my mind was not the thematic and aesthetic synergy between the autumn hills of the past and the future, but the design and mechanical congruence. As a side-by-side comparison under closer examination reveals that the level design is an almost exact replica of a different perspective from one game to another. There are platforms, stumps, and caves, all in the same sequence and orientation. There's a shopkeeper at the bottom of a pit, a gorgeous view of the mountain as both characters ascend a cliffside, and the same boss, complete with the same attack patterns and vulnerabilities. It's incredibly entertaining and intriguing. And after all of these little details were brought to my attention, I was even more floored by both games because the deeper nature of the connection proves to be so much more valuable than mere aesthetic references. I've since studied countless interviews Thierry Boulanger has participated in, and part of what I found so interesting was how consistent he is in describing the studio's goals and the game design journey that follows them, beginning with that initial process of analysis, pruning, and re-implementation of modernized features. But what I think has really begun to set Sabotage apart with the release of Sea of Stars is this innate desire to resist settling into a comfortable niche. They could have just made The Messenger 2. After all, that game similarly has a peculiar story full of material that could be more thoroughly explored in subsequent DLCs or even a full sequel at this point. But they didn't. They're a tight-knit team that loves all kinds of classic games, seeking new experiences to continue learning from. Part of the reason they all left more secure jobs to begin building a new legacy with Sabotage was the freedom of being able to apply their ideas to all different kinds of genres of a retro flavor. And by prioritizing the longevity of the studio and cohesion of the team from the very beginning in 2016, they've since been able to effectively apply what they've learned from one game to the next. The Messenger was unabashedly a game about flow. Offering a sense of flow is arguably one of the highest priorities of a platformer, and to me, the key is to provide fun tools to overcome just the right amount of friction, which obviously varies due to preference. Every screen is assembled with purpose, as level geometry and enemies are carefully placed to catch careless players off guard while rewarding those who intelligently absorb the challenge and remain focused. Too much friction can take players out of the experience, but so can too little, which is why the most widely appealing games often try to strike an ideal balance. And Sea of Stars is no different. It starts with the modification and refinement of the battle system Chrono Trigger pioneered, removing random encounters to make battles feel more purposeful, making each and every decision engaging with the unique lock break system and attributes unique to the Solstice Warriors, allowing party members to switch places in combat at will and have them revive after a turn penalty that can be accelerated with additional mana or items if the player so chooses. Anything that minimizes the chances of players giving up, be it from too much friction or lack thereof, was considered. But what pushes this game's systems even further beyond a game like Chrono Trigger for me is how this philosophy extends to exploration and traversal, ensuring the moment-to-moment play taking place between the highlights remains engaging. In moments where a lack of friction takes me out of the experience, the little and seemingly inconsequential choices go such a long way. The full range of movement, coupled with such basic interactions as jumping across small gaps, climbing walls, clambering ledges, and gathering materials, changes how you interact with the world, building the understanding needed to solve layered puzzles with platformer-adjacent abilities like the Mistral Bracelet and Grapploo. Even the pirate ship feels as it should with basic considerations for acceleration and turning. When I play this game, I feel like I'm playing an RPG made by a studio that wants to share their love for all different kinds of games, especially platformers. It starts with The Messenger, and it's a big reason why this game feels specifically tailored to me, but it also speaks to a wider theme informing Sabotage's design that can be translated through more than just the addition of action and platforming elements. In Thierry's own words,
like the key metric that we have is everything should be done before the player is, right?
What this means is Sabotage's games should never overstay their welcome. There is always something interesting to do, and that something needs to be compared favorably to the next most interesting thing, whether it's a mechanic, location, or plot beat. Players should never feel the need to grind in Sea of Stars, nor should they feel lost on how to progress, as the world appears large and open from an overhead view, yet guides players through these pockets of linearity best served by islands on an open ocean. It's fairly rare to be required to visit a location twice before the end of the game, but when it is, it's usually to portray great change in the environment. Just as you begin to grow fatigued from a particular area, Sea of Stars isn't remotely afraid of leaning into its messenger roots to throw something wildly different in your face. Judging by the amount of time I gave to Sea of Stars without much of any desire to quit, I'd argue that, from a gameplay perspective, this design choice was an effective one. But I also think its application to this game in particular, being a story-centric RPG, opens it up to more questions than its predecessor may have received. Because I believe it has led to certain narrative choices beginning in its final act that contribute to the first alluded, polarizing conclusion. To briefly summarize, without divulging too many specific details, following the climax of the narrative's second act, the story reaches its natural emotional apex. And it's through this scene that the three prophecies introduced early on are just short of being completely resolved. It appears as though there isn't much left to do besides watch the Solstice Warriors realize their full potential and stop the big bad guy. And while that does end up happening, it doesn't play out as succinctly as one might expect. In addition to the final battle, there is an entire third act whose purpose is to explore the remaining party members' motivations, as well as set up the true ending, gated by a completion bonus. While the pace of the gameplay loop remains as tight as it ever was, one could argue that in this third act, there's just too much going on with respect to world building and the imminent plot, piling on new questions in place of resolutions. And I think the biggest problem with this chapter is how interesting it all is. For as little screen time and resolution, some of the key moments are afforded, teasing the main antagonist's true motivations and the wider ramifications of his actions before culminating in an ending with very little payoff for these specific revelations. It's actually so cool, raising the stakes that much higher. And it led me to believe I was in for an incredible climax with all the little pieces clicking into place. Maybe I was naive, missing the forest for the trees, but I can't lie and say I didn't feel highly confused at the very least, wondering if the game I just spent roughly 30 hours falling in love with was tarnished by a rushed ending. Let me reiterate something very clearly. That changed after playing The Messenger, but not in the way one may expect or even hope. In fact, playing The Messenger did not absolve much of anything that goes unfinished in this third act, but it does paint a clearer picture of what I believe this is all supposed to mean. And if I end up completely wrong, well, I'll just have to deal with a little egg on my face. This is setup. In the months following The Messenger's release, Sabotage used their Discord server to conduct a thorough, interactive experiment with the most dedicated members of their community. This type of experiment is most commonly known as an alternate reality game, or ARG. And in this case, it was primarily delivered by a then brand new character current Sea of Stars players will be highly familiar with, the Archivist. Most notably, this ARG culminated in the teasing of Project Solstice, generating internal hype for the eventual reveal of Sea of Stars. But what I think it will be remembered for in the long run is how it ushered in the wider Sabotage universe. The Archivist revealed his tale to be one of forbidden love, one that will presumably be told over the course of many timelines and worlds in the form of books given to the studio to source for their new games. In the same way that Sea of Stars sought to answer questions posed by The Messenger, it's leaving room for its successor to do the same. And the truth is, there is a great deal of risk that comes with that, particularly with an RPG trying to pay homage to one of the greatest, succinctly told stories in the medium. I'm sure we've all experienced stories that end up stringing us along in a way that feels remarkably unsatisfying. As a teenager, I remember being completely blown away by the overarching plotline of the early Assassin's Creed games, only before feeling monumentally let down as that story began to spiral into contrived nonsense after it had clearly become Ubisoft's tentpole franchise, and thus a story they had no incentive to conclude, which I think poses an uncomfortable but honest question. Could Sabotage fall victim to an opposite problem with a similar result? Without the security a multi-billion-dollar corporation can provide at the very least, what happens to the story if the doors to Sabotage close prematurely before or after their next game? What if they just can't get it together in the end? What's the use in getting attached to these characters and world if there's a real chance it will never receive closure? Well, I can only speak for myself, so let me tell you why I care. In the Messenger, there are a number of side stories that the player can listen to should they decide to spend a little more time with the shopkeeper than perhaps the average player would. Fairly comparable to the additional stories told by Teeks, the historian in Sea of Stars, they're optional by design, with no bearing on the ninja's story. But I would not recommend skipping them because, aside from being highly entertaining, they're often paired with a philosophical twist. In fact, before continuing, I do have to strongly urge anyone interested in the Messenger at this point consider whether or not you would be better off experiencing these stories organically. Because throughout my time with both Sea of Stars and the Messenger, I never felt more sure I was playing the right game, not after reaching the end credits, but when I read the final short story about a boy stuck in a well. The story is as follows. There once was a little boy stuck in a well. It wasn't really clear why he was there. People assumed he fell while playing, or that someone had pushed him in. In truth, he had jumped in there himself. He spent years in the well, wasting away anxiously, feeling utterly inadequate. He had a deep desire to share his ideas with the world, but shame having played such a big part in his upbringing, his will lay broken. That's why the well suited him so perfectly. A place to hide, where he could be alone with his stories, with no one to mock or judge him. A safe life, unfortunately devoid of purpose, but at least shielded from rejection. One day, as he was role-playing, a wanderer passing by looked down the well. "Hey, what's going on down there?" he asked curiously, intent on joining in on the fun. "Oh, nothing. Sorry about the noise," the little boy replied. And thus, the well remained silent for weeks. The wanderer, patient and compassionate, sat by the well for all that time. His mind was already made up. He would do whatever it took to get that little boy out of there, so that he could share his stories with the world. The creative flame in that little boy's heart refused to die, and eventually, he started role-playing again. And so the wanderer, very cautiously, started interacting with him again, telling him that his stories were entertaining and nothing to be ashamed of. Their friendship built really slowly, based on genuine intentions and trust. A few months later, the wanderer and the little boy were sitting together in the well, laughing and sharing stories. The well became an increasingly habitable place, and passers-by started looking in. "I think I'm not the only one who would like to hear your stories," the wanderer mused one day. "I'm too afraid to climb out," the little boy replied. "It's okay," the wanderer reassured him. "Let me know when you are ready." Years passed, the little boy's imagination becoming more focused, his thoughts and stories shaping into a concrete little world. And then one day, he decided to take the chance. He would build this world and show it to everyone. The wanderer helped him climb out. Merci, Philippe. The little boy shared his ideas with creators of all crafts, and to his surprise, they wanted to help build it. And so, the small team was put together, and he officially became a writer. I wish I could tell you it all ended in fame and fortune, but I trust you understand it's not what this whole journey has ever been about anyways. Merci, Sylvain. Merci, Eric. Merci, Martin. Merci, Mikhail. Merci, Philippe. Merci, Jean-Luc. Merci, Carl. Merci, Savannah. Merci, Magali. The Wanderer was Philippe Barclay, the creators of all crafts, the growing team at Sabotage Studio, and the boy? Thierry. It's not so often that a video game designed to be consumed by an indeterminable amount of complete strangers goes to such a raw place in such a direct and confident manner. And as a somewhat creative person seeking growth in uncertain places, who on more than one occasion has laid just about everything on the line in writing, in a video, at the risk of exposing my fear and insecurities to a world that often takes pleasure in twisting the knife, just for the hope that maybe I can find some purpose and help someone else along the way. Parasocial relationships be damned, reading this passage felt like staring into a mirror, and it made certain a belief I had begun to feel just moments after beginning the Messenger. In addition to feeling heard by Thierry's story, I realized this is a team more than worthy of my support. And in its return, I know I'm going to receive a badass game every time that isn't afraid to ask tough questions, make mistakes in pursuit of growth, and let passion guide it to success. Even beyond the sheer quality of the world design and storytelling, and the promise that each cherished concept they touch will be handled with careful consideration. What I think makes this world worth buying into is the Sabotage approach. While Thierry stands at the forefront and is undoubtedly a man of many hats, this studio clearly values each and every member of the team, often taking opportunities to celebrate their impact more than the average developer by frequently peeling back the curtain and interacting with their community. I can only imagine how difficult it must be to buy fully into someone else's creative vision. But the evidence suggests that trust and chemistry has been cultivated for over a decade, even before the longest-standing members left their jobs to join this new venture. And thus far, Sabotage has demonstrated great efforts to retain staff in an industry that has an ugly habit of pressing the reset button when things go wrong, blowing up entire studios in the process. In order to avoid layoffs after shipping a new product as much as possible, they assign portions of the team to working on supplemental DLC, while the rest begin pre-production for what comes next. Part of the reason they've committed to pixel art for the foreseeable future is to work within the expertise of the team they have right now. And even if they decide to pursue a 3D project in the future, Thierry has stated that they would tackle it in much the same way as their predecessors did, giving their current artists time to adapt to the new style. It appears as though Sabotage is a rare example of a company in which loyalty is rewarded, and in turn, their projects and patrons will be rewarded with a consistent team to continue cultivating such special works. In that way, in spite of any criticism it may receive from myself or others, I believe the narrative of Sea of Stars captures the artistry that went into it. As I reached closer and closer to its end, I began to evaluate how the game managed to subvert my expectations the way The Messenger did. Centered around duty and friendship, the party's will is tested when things take a turn for the worse. Their authority figure crumbles, and due to his trauma, asserts there is no longer any use in continuing to fight when his plan is disrupted by unforeseen evils. But in spite of the terrible circumstances that surround them, they get back up and prevail. Their resolve, best represented not by a spirit of unbreakable will, a vengeful, dimension-hopping assassin, an immortal and omniscient alchemist, or even the ascended guardian gods themselves, but a simple warrior cook with a heart of gold. Love him or hate him, to me, Garl is Sea of Stars. With no innate magic to call his own and several run-ins with harm, Garl has been given every reason to consider staying in his lane while standing by, watching his friends fulfill their duty from a safe distance. But he doesn't, and time again draws from his inner strength to make both great and small change, leaving every place and relationship a little bit better than how he found it. Garl is the everyman's hero, the catalyst for his friend's ascent into godhood, and through his unwavering strength and kindness is the best representation of Sabotage's goal as a developer. They shoot for the stars. Choosing to self-publish Sea of Stars wasn't a safer business decision, but it was a step towards establishing their own lasting legacy. When everyone told them contributions to their soundtrack from the legendary Yasunori Mitsuda wasn't an option, they were not deterred. And when Thierry was given every opportunity to remove his deeply personal story from The Messenger, he didn't, because he recognized the opportunity to offer a piece of himself to leave the world a bit better than how he found it. I know not every player thinks the way I do. In fact, I'm sure a certain type of person will disagree with me, arguing I'm overhyping these games while putting their creators on a pedestal, while the average player likely just wants to experience a good game without entangling themselves in the struggles it took to get here. But the fact is, I don't know anyone else doing it quite like Sabotage. And for those that are, I want to find them and celebrate them. While the landscape of game development continues to change, resulting in this continued renaissance of passionate creators finding their independence just like Thierry and the many members of Sabotage did, the reward for players are new, bold games that elevate the lives of the people who play and make them. And what I've found after trying to understand what goes into developing a game like this is that learning where it comes from not only makes you appreciate it a hell of a lot more, but also clues you into where to look to find what's next. That's why, even if the journey gets a little messy, I'm keeping my eyes on Sabotage. And maybe you should too. Hey guys, it's Wizzy. It's a new year, which means new content, and I'm hoping that this sort of video acts as something of a tone setter for my channel moving into this year. But before I can really explain what exactly that means, I do want to pay some specific acknowledgement to some really great sources that made a video like this possible. Including the countless interviews I listened to involving Thierry himself, there were a few really big pieces of media that did a lot of the heavy lifting for me, and this video would not have been possible without them. The first being the Behind the Schemes documentary for the release of The Messenger, presented by Devolver Digital on their YouTube channel, followed by the Making of Sea of Stars documentary on the Escapist channel, and last but certainly not least, if you go on the Sabotage Studio website, there is an entire page dedicated to chronicling the first 5 years of the studio's history, which was put together by the executive producer, Philippe Barclay. And that in particular was freaking instrumental in piecing everything together in order for me to get the story right in a piece like this. You know, in this specific case of really extending the visibility of the story of Sabotage, I clearly lucked out big time, because not every studio has the energy, the time, or the funds to really put so much passion into keeping their own history alive. So it's really appreciated on my end. In the off chance that this reaches any of the members of Sabotage, I sincerely want to say thank you for being a real force for good in this industry, and I really have become a lifelong fan. I'm so excited to see what the future holds for your studio. I'm recording this on January 25th, and in just 1 month, the amount of layoffs that have impacted the game industry in 2024 has already reached nearly 50% of what happened in the entirety of the previous year. Really, all signs right now are showing that the games industry is headed into a really rough year, and while it's easy to kind of just sit back and feel kind of powerless while showing solidarity for the jobs that have already been lost, I think what I want to do is continue basically doing what I'm already doing, but place more of a focus on highlighting stories like these that I think can help lead the industry to a more sustainable future. I'm obviously still learning myself, so right now I'm kind of just trying to absorb as much information as I reasonably can. But in the future, I really think I want to try talking to developers on my own. Because aside from these issues desperately needing more visibility from the general public, I genuinely just find them really fascinating. Of course, I also really need to thank my patrons for allowing me to take more of the time that's really necessary to make videos like these, including my top tier supporters, Julian Messmer, Questing Refuge, and Blacktooth Bob. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.